Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. If you've subscribed for more stories, enjoy the ride now. The mating halls of Viridia Prime hummed with the kind of desperate energy that only came from beings trying too hard to appear desirable. Zara Vel'thara watched from her corner seat as another perfectly sculpted Andromedian male flexed his way through a strength demonstration, his 4 arms rippling with muscles that could probably crush a small asteroid. The crowd of potential mates cooed appreciatively, their bioscanners chirping with approval at his genetic markers. Zara's own scanner remained silent, as it had for the past 3 ceremonies. Not because her genetics were inferior, her family line boasted some of Viridia's most accomplished scientists, but because her curved spine and the mobility device that helped her walk didn't fit the ceremony's narrow definition of mate-worthy perfection. Specimen 4847 demonstrates optimal strength ratios, announced the ceremony coordinator, a centaurian whose voice carried the enthusiasm of someone paid to make even the most mundane genetic displays sound thrilling. Seeking compatible partner for enhanced offspring potential. Bidding begins at standard reproductive contract rates. Zara suppressed a snort. Bidding. As if choosing a mate was the same as purchasing agricultural equipment, which, given her background in xenobotany, was a comparison she understood far too well. At least farming machinery came with warranty agreements and performance guarantees. Her biopad chimed softly with incoming research data from her laboratory. While other beings spent their time primping and posturing, Zara had been analyzing hybrid seed genetics that could revolutionize food production across 17 different atmospheric conditions. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could engineer solutions to feed entire worlds, but couldn't engineer her spine into the configuration that would make her attractive to potential partners. Dr. Vel'thara, a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to see Dr. Marcus Threnodin, one of her research colleagues, approaching with the careful expression of someone about to deliver uncomfortable news. "I wanted to speak with you before the next round of presentations." "Let me guess," Zara said, not looking up from her data pad. "You've been chosen by that lovely Rigelian biochemist with the impressive cranial capacity, and you wanted to tell me before I heard it through official channels." Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed. "Zara, you know it's not personal. The Genetics Council ran our compatibility projections, and her research into neural enhancement compounds complements my work perfectly. From a purely scientific standpoint. It makes perfect sense," Zara finished. "And I'm happy for you, Marcus. Genuinely. She's brilliant, her posture is impeccable, and your offspring will probably solve the unified field theory before they're potty trained. That's not, I mean, you're brilliant too. More brilliant than any of us. It's just that the council considers certain factors." "Certain factors," Zara repeated, gesturing toward her mobility device with mock seriousness. "You mean my inability to demonstrate impressive physical prowess by lifting heavy objects or performing elaborate mating dances. Strange how genetic superiority seems to require such specific choreography." The ceremony coordinator's voice boomed across the hall again. Specimen 4851 presents dual-lung respiratory systems adapted for multiple atmospheric conditions. Seeking partner for enhanced environmental adaptability in offspring. See. Zara said to Marcus. "Even the respiratory systems get more attention than I do. Though I suppose dual lungs are more immediately obvious than hybrid plant genetics that could prevent famine across 12 sectors." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "The system isn't perfect, Zara. But it's designed to ensure genetic optimization for species survival. Surely you understand the logic from a scientific perspective." "Oh, I understand the logic perfectly," Zara said, finally looking up from her research. "I just think it's stupid logic. But don't worry about me, Marcus. I have 17 different grain varieties that need cross-pollination analysis, and unlike potential mates, they don't care about my spinal curvature." As Marcus retreated with obvious relief, Zara returned her attention to her biopad. The research was genuinely fascinating, she discovered that combining Terran wheat genetics with Viridian mineral processing capabilities could create crops that thrived in previously uninhabitable soil conditions. It was the kind of breakthrough that could change the galaxy, but it wouldn't change the fact that she'd be going home alone again. "Excuse me," said a voice with an unfamiliar accent. "Are you Dr. Vel'thara?" Zara looked up to see a human male standing beside her seat, holding what appeared to be a standard agricultural scanner and wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested he actually worked with plants rather than just theorizing about them. His hair was slightly disheveled, his eyes were bright with genuine interest, and he had the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent time outdoors. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Though if you're looking for genetic compatibility assessments, you might want to try the display areas. I'm just here for observational purposes." "Actually," the human said, settling into the seat beside her without invitation, "I was hoping to discuss your research on atmospheric crop adaptation." "I'm David Chen, agricultural engineer from the Terra Nova colony. I've been following your published work on mineral substrate integration, and I think you might have solved a problem we've been wrestling with for 3 years." Zara blinked. "You want to discuss research? Here? During a mating ceremony?" "Well, technically I'm supposed to be observing your cultural practices for a diplomatic report," David said with a grin that suggested he found the whole situation as absurd as she did. "But your research is infinitely more interesting than watching people demonstrate their ability to lift heavy objects. Though I have to admit, some of these displays are impressively athletic." "You're not participating?" Zara asked, surprised by her own disappointment at the thought. "In the ceremony?" "Oh, no. Humans have different approaches to mate selection. We tend to focus on factors like compatibility, shared interests, and whether we enjoy each other's company. Physical prowess is optional, and genetic optimization is more of a happy accident than a primary goal." "How wonderfully inefficient," Zara said, though her tone suggested she found the inefficiency appealing. "Terribly inefficient," David agreed cheerfully. "We also have this strange habit of choosing partners based on whether they make us laugh, challenge our thinking, or inspire us to be better people. Very unscientific approach, really." The ceremony coordinator announced another pairing, and the crowd's enthusiasm reached new heights as 2 particularly impressive specimens began what could generously be called a courtship display and less generously described as elaborate showing off. "So about this mineral substrate integration," David continued, pulling out his own biopad. "We've got colonies on worlds with soil compositions that should theoretically support agriculture, but traditional Earth crops keep failing. Your research suggests that integrating Viridian mineral processing genes could create hybrid varieties that actually thrive in these conditions." Zara found herself leaning forward with interest despite the absurd setting. "The key is understanding how Viridian plants evolved to extract nutrients from crystalline substrates. If you can introduce those genetic mechanisms into Earth crops while maintaining their growth patterns, you create plants that view challenging soil as an opportunity rather than an obstacle." "Exactly." David's excitement was infectious. "But the implementation challenges have been significant. We've tried 17 different approaches, and each one either kills the crops or produces plants that taste like they've been marinated in battery acid. That's because you're approaching it as genetic replacement rather than genetic enhancement," Zara explained, her mobility limitations forgotten as she became absorbed in the problem. "You can't just substitute Viridian genes for Earth genes, you have to create hybrid sequences that allow both systems to function cooperatively." Their conversation was interrupted by the coordinator's announcement: "The ceremony now enters its final phase. All potential mates will present their optimal genetic markers for final selection." "I should probably go," Zara said, the reminder of her circumstances dampening her enthusiasm. "The ceremony's ending, and I need to return to my laboratory." "Actually," David said, standing up and offering her his hand, "I have a question for you." "About the research?" "No," David said, his expression suddenly serious. "About you. Dr. Vel'thara, Zara, would you consider being my mate?" The question hit the ceremony hall like a sonic boom. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, displays froze in place, and several beings with sensitive hearing organs actually winced. The coordinator's voice faltered as every eye in the vast space turned toward the unlikely pair. "I'm sorry," Zara said quietly, certain she'd misheard. "What did you just ask me?" "I asked if you'd be my mate," David repeated, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "I know we've just met, but I've been reading your research for months. You're brilliant, innovative, and you approach problems in ways that challenge conventional thinking. Plus, you have a sense of humor about absurd situations, which I find incredibly attractive. So, what do you say?" Zara stared at him, aware that the entire ceremony had ground to a halt and everyone was waiting for her response. Her mind raced through a dozen reasons why his proposal was impossible, impractical, and probably motivated by misguided sympathy. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Yes." The ceremony hall erupted into chaos, but Zara barely noticed. She was too busy staring into the eyes of the first person who had ever seen her as someone worth choosing. The aftermath of David's proposal resembled what Zara imagined a diplomatic incident might look like if it involved more confusion and less actual diplomacy. 3 different council members were simultaneously demanding genetic compatibility scans, psychological evaluations, and what appeared to be a formal investigation into whether humans were mentally stable enough to participate in interspecies mating ceremonies. "This is highly irregular," announced Councillor Vel'thara, whose 4 eyes provided him with the ability to glare disapprovingly from multiple angles at once. "The human has bypassed all established protocols. There have been no compatibility assessments, no genetic projections, no family lineage reviews. Also no strength demonstrations," added Councillor Miranth helpfully. "How are we supposed to evaluate mate-worthiness without proper displays of physical prowess?" David, who was handling the bureaucratic chaos with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with agricultural permit applications, raised his hand politely. "If it helps, I can lift moderately heavy objects. I once moved a broken tractor engine, though I did need help from 3 other people and a mechanical winch." "That's not the point," Vel'thara huffed. "The point is that mate selection requires careful consideration of genetic compatibility, reproductive potential, and optimal offspring characteristics. You've chosen Dr. Vel'thara based on, what exactly?" "Well," David said thoughtfully, "she's brilliant, she makes me laugh, she's solving problems that could feed millions of beings, and she has the most beautiful pointed ears I've ever seen. Also, she didn't immediately walk away when I started talking about soil composition, which suggests impressive tolerance for agricultural discussions." Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment about her ears, while several council members looked as though they were developing headaches from trying to process David's non-traditional criteria. "Beautiful ears are not a recognized genetic marker," Miranth pointed out with the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow student. "Maybe not," David said, "but they're definitely aesthetically pleasing, and that should count for something. Besides, I've read her research papers. Anyone who can engineer crops to thrive in 17 different atmospheric conditions probably has excellent genetic material, regardless of what your scanners say about her spine. Her spinal curvature presents significant challenges for offspring development," Vel'thara insisted. "The probability projections for successful reproduction are well below acceptable parameters." "According to whose parameters?" David asked, and Zara could hear genuine curiosity in his voice rather than defensiveness. "Because human reproductive success doesn't seem to correlate with spinal geometry. We have this wonderful concept called medical technology that helps with complications, and genetic diversity that suggests variation is actually beneficial for species survival." The coordinator, who had been frantically consulting her protocol's handbook, finally found her voice. "The human makes valid points about alternative selection criteria, but we still require formal compatibility testing before any bonding ceremonies can proceed." "Fine," David said agreeably. "What does that involve? Blood samples? Psychological profiles? Agricultural knowledge assessment? Because I'm confident we'll score well on at least 2 of those categories." Zara watched the exchange with growing amusement and disbelief. David was treating the most prestigious mating ceremony in the galaxy like a slightly complicated job interview, complete with questions about qualifications and requirements. His matter-of-fact approach to their bureaucratic protests was deflating their authority more effectively than any argument could have. The testing process is quite comprehensive, Vel'thara warned. Genetic compatibility, psychological evaluation, physical fitness assessments, cultural adaptation scenarios, and reproductive compatibility projections. Most bonding pairs require weeks of preparation. How long do we have? Zara asked, speaking up for the first time since accepting David's proposal. Standard protocol allows 72 hours for emergency compatibility certification, the coordinator replied. Though I should warn you that the failure rate for expedited testing is quite high, particularly for cross-species pairings with significant physiological differences. Significant physiological differences, David repeated thoughtfully. You mean like the fact that I'm human and she's Viridian, or the fact that she's incredibly intelligent and I mostly know about dirt? Both, Mirrenth said seriously, apparently missing David's humor entirely. Cross-species bonding requires careful consideration of communication barriers, cultural differences, reproductive biology, and long-term compatibility factors. Well, David said, turning to Zara with a smile, what do you think? Are you willing to spend the next 3 days proving we're compatible enough to be together? Zara looked at him, this strange, cheerful human who had somehow seen past everything that made her unsuitable in Viridian society and decided she was worth choosing. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the ways their pairing was impractical, impossible, and doomed to failure. The rest of her mind was too busy marveling at the fact that someone actually wanted to try. I think, she said carefully, that it might be interesting to see what happens when human stubbornness meets Viridian scientific methodology. Excellent, David said. Though I should warn you that my stubbornness is legendary. I once spent 6 months trying to grow Earth tomatoes in Martian soil before admitting they needed genetic modification. Only 6 months? Zara asked with mock surprise. I spent 2 years trying to create crops that could photosynthesize cosmic radiation before realizing that plants need actual light sources. This is exactly the kind of shared experience that suggests compatibility, David announced to the increasingly bewildered council members. We both have experience with spectacular agricultural failures. That's got to be worth something in your evaluation criteria. The first compatibility test turned out to be a psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. HFY, a Centaurian psychiatrist whose approach to mental health assessment involved asking increasingly personal questions while monitoring bio-readings for signs of deception or instability. Dr. Chen, she began, her scanner humming as it recorded his responses, why did you choose Dr. Vel'thara as a potential mate when there were numerous other candidates present? Because she was the only one doing actual work instead of showing off, David replied honestly. Also, her research could revolutionize agriculture across multiple star systems, which strikes me as a pretty impressive qualification for a life partner. And you weren't concerned about her physical limitations? Should I be? David asked, genuinely puzzled. She's one of the galaxy's leading xenobotanists. Her mobility device doesn't affect her brain function, and frankly, I'm more concerned about whether she'll get bored dealing with someone whose idea of genetic engineering involves crossing different varieties of corn. Dr. HFY turned to Zara. Dr. Vel'thara, what attracted you to Dr. Chen's proposal? He asked, Zara said simply. In 3 ceremonies, he's the first being who looked at me and saw someone worth choosing. Also, his questions about my research were actually intelligent, which is rarer than you might expect. But surely you have concerns about cross-species compatibility? I have concerns about everything, Zara admitted. But most of my concerns involve whether our research methodologies are compatible, not our biology. If we can successfully collaborate on agricultural projects, the rest seems manageable. The physical compatibility testing proved more challenging, mainly because the testing protocols were designed for beings with similar physiological capabilities. David's solution was to treat each test as a collaborative problem-solving exercise rather than a competition. The strength assessment requires both partners to demonstrate coordinated lifting capacity, the test administrator explained, indicating a series of increasingly heavy objects. Right, David said, studying the setup. Zara, what if you handle the technical coordination while I provide the actual lifting? Your engineering background gives you better spatial reasoning for optimal weight distribution. It worked beautifully. Zara's analysis of leverage points and weight distribution allowed David to lift objects far beyond his individual capacity, while her strategic thinking compensated for her limited mobility. They scored higher than most traditionally matched pairs, much to the administrator's confusion. This is highly unusual, the coordinator noted after reviewing their results. Your individual scores were mediocre, but your collaborative performance exceeded all projections. Maybe, David suggested, that's because we're planning to be partners, not competitors. Turns out compatibility isn't about being identical, it's about being complementary. By the end of the second day, their testing scores were generating significant attention throughout the facility. Other potential mates began observing their sessions, taking notes on their collaborative approach to challenges that were typically viewed as individual assessments. You know, Zara said as they completed their final cultural adaptation scenario, I think we might actually be good at this partnership thing. Only one more day of tests, David replied. Though I have to admit, spending 3 days proving we're compatible has been more fun than I expected. Even if some of these evaluations are completely ridiculous. Tomorrow's the reproductive compatibility assessment, Zara said quietly. That's likely to be complicated. We'll figure it out, David said with the same confidence he'd shown throughout the entire process. After all, we've already proven that two supposedly incompatible beings can work together to achieve impossible results. How hard could one more test be? 6 months after their bonding ceremony, which had become the most watched interspecies event in galactic broadcasting history, David and Zara had established their research facility on Terra Nova with the kind of efficiency that made agricultural engineers weep with joy. Their converted habitat dome hummed with the controlled chaos of serious scientific work. Hydroponic growing chambers lined one wall, genetic sequencing equipment occupied the center space, and Zara's mobility-accessible laboratory setup allowed her to conduct complex botanical analyses without missing a single procedural step. The Kepler colony samples are responding better than projected, Zara announced from her specialized workstation, which David had designed to accommodate both her mobility device and her need to access multiple research tools simultaneously. Hybrid Generation 7 is showing 93% survival rates in simulated atmospheric conditions. That's fantastic, David said, carefully transplanting seedlings that glowed with bioluminescent markers indicating successful genetic integration. The Martian Agricultural Consortium is going to be thrilled. They've been struggling with crop failure for 3 growing seasons. Their success had attracted attention from across the galaxy, but not always the kind they appreciated. The morning brought another delegation of reporters, scientists, and what Zara had begun calling inspiration tourists, beings who wanted to document their relationship as proof that love conquered all obstacles. Dr. Vel'thara, called a particularly persistent Andromedian journalist whose 4 arms allowed her to operate multiple recording devices simultaneously, how do you respond to critics who claim your relationship only works because humans have lower standards for mate selection? I respond by pointing to our agricultural output, Zara said without looking up from her microscope. Our hybrid crops are feeding 17 colonies that were facing food shortages 6 months ago. If that's what happens when humans have lower standards, maybe other species should consider lowering their standards too. David suppressed a laugh while adjusting the atmospheric controls in growing chamber 3. Their facility had become a pilgrimage site for other, mismatched, couples and individuals who'd been overlooked by conventional mate selection processes. The previous week, they'd hosted a Rigelian physicist whose cybernetic implants made him unsuitable, according to traditional standards, and a Centaurian artist whose creative temperament was considered genetically unstable. The real question, David added, addressing the journalist while monitoring soil pH levels, is why everyone's so fascinated by the idea that we're happy together. We collaborate well, we solve interesting problems, and we laugh at each other's jokes. That seems like pretty standard relationship criteria to me. But surely you face unique challenges due to Dr. Vel'thara's mobility limitations? Zara finally looked up from her work, her pointed ears flicking with annoyance. My mobility device doesn't limit my research capabilities any more than David's lack of 4 arms limits his transplanting efficiency. We design our workspace around our actual needs rather than theoretical ideals, and it works remarkably well. The journalist persisted. What about reproductive planning? The genetic compatibility report suggested significant challenges. The genetic compatibility reports, David said with the tone of someone who'd had this conversation too many times, were based on theoretical projections that assumed reproduction was our primary goal. We're more interested in advancing agricultural science than optimizing offspring genetics, though we appreciate the concern. After the reporters finally left, David and Zara settled into their evening routine of reviewing research data and planning the next day's experiments. Their living space occupied the facility's residential section, designed with the same attention to accessibility and efficiency as their laboratory. I got a message from the Viridian Science Council today, Zara mentioned, calling up a holographic display of her correspondence. They want to offer me a position as Director of Interspecies Agricultural Research. Full funding, unlimited research budget, choice of facilities. David paused in his review of soil composition analyses. That's incredible, Zara. It's everything you've worked toward. What did you tell them? I told them I'd consider it if they offered you the position of co-director, she said, watching his expression carefully. Turns out our collaborative methodology is more valuable than my individual research credentials. They agreed to that? They agreed to that, Zara confirmed with satisfaction. Apparently, our success rate has convinced them that human-Viridian research partnerships might be worth investigating further. We're being offered the 6 months after their bonding ceremony, which had become the most watched interspecies event in galactic broadcasting history. David and Zara had established their research facility on Terra Nova with the kind of efficiency that made agricultural engineers weep with joy. Their converted habitat dome hummed with the controlled chaos of serious scientific work. Hydroponic growing chambers lined one wall, genetic sequencing equipment occupied the center space, and Zara's mobility-accessible laboratory setup allowed her to conduct complex botanical analyses without missing a single procedural step. The Kepler colony samples are responding better than projected, Zara announced from her specialized workstation, which David had designed to accommodate both her mobility device and her need to access multiple research tools simultaneously. Hybrid Generation 7 is showing 93% survival rates in simulated atmospheric conditions. That's fantastic, David said, carefully transplanting seedlings that glowed with bioluminescent markers indicating successful genetic integration. The Martian Agricultural Consortium is going to be thrilled. They've been struggling with crop failure for 3 growing seasons. Their success had attracted attention from across the galaxy, but not always the kind they appreciated. The morning brought another delegation of reporters, scientists, and what Zara had begun calling inspiration tourists, beings who wanted to document their relationship as proof that love conquered all obstacles. Dr. Vel'thara, called a particularly persistent Andromedian journalist whose 4 arms allowed her to operate multiple recording devices simultaneously, how do you respond to critics who claim your relationship only works because humans have lower standards for mate selection? I respond by pointing to our agricultural output, Zara said without looking up from her microscope. Our hybrid crops are feeding 17 colonies that were facing food shortages 6 months ago. If that's what happens when humans have lower standards, maybe other species should consider lowering their standards too. David suppressed a laugh while adjusting the atmospheric controls in growing chamber 3. Their facility had become a pilgrimage site for other, mismatched, couples and individuals who'd been overlooked by conventional mate selection processes. The previous week, they'd hosted a Rigelian physicist whose cybernetic implants made him unsuitable, according to traditional standards, and a Centaurian artist whose creative temperament was considered genetically unstable. The real question, David added, addressing the journalist while monitoring soil pH levels, is why everyone's so fascinated by the idea that we're happy together. We collaborate well, we solve interesting problems, and we laugh at each other's jokes. That seems like pretty standard relationship criteria to me. But surely you face unique challenges due to Dr. Vel'thara's mobility limitations? Zara finally looked up from her work, her pointed ears flicking with annoyance. My mobility device doesn't limit my research capabilities any more than David's lack of 4 arms limits his transplanting efficiency. We design our workspace around our actual needs rather than theoretical ideals, and it works remarkably well. The journalist persisted. What about reproductive planning? The genetic compatibility report suggested significant challenges. The genetic compatibility reports, David said with the tone of someone who'd had this conversation too many times, were based on theoretical projections that assumed reproduction was our primary goal. We're more interested in advancing agricultural science than optimizing offspring genetics, though we appreciate the concern. After the reporters finally left, David and Zara settled into their evening routine of reviewing research data and planning the next day's experiments. Their living space occupied the facility's residential section, designed with the same attention to accessibility and efficiency as their laboratory. I got a message from the Viridian Science Council today, Zara mentioned, calling up a holographic display of her correspondence. They want to offer me a position as Director of Interspecies Agricultural Research. Full funding, unlimited research budget, choice of facilities. David paused in his review of soil composition analyses. That's incredible, Zara. It's everything you've worked toward. What did you tell them? I told them I'd consider it if they offered you the position of co-director, she said, watching his expression carefully. Turns out our collaborative methodology is more valuable than my individual research credentials. They agreed to that? They agreed to that, Zara confirmed with satisfaction. Apparently, our success rate has convinced them that human Viridian research partnerships might be worth investigating further. We're being offered the chance to establish a permanent institute for interspecies agricultural development. David set down his data pad and moved to her workstation, settling into the chair he'd positioned there for their evening discussions. The atmosphere of Tau Ceti Prime felt like breathing through wet concrete mixed with industrial solvent, which was exactly what Director Colven had warned them to expect. Zara's environmental adaptation suit hummed quietly as its filters processed the contaminated air into something her Viridian physiology could actually use, while simultaneously providing the mobility assistance she needed to navigate the colony's uneven terrain. Atmospheric readings are worse than the initial report suggested, Zara announced, consulting the suit's integrated sensors while David collected soil samples from the failed growing fields. Sulfur content is 30% higher than our projections, and there are mineral particulates that weren't mentioned in the environmental data. Which explains why nothing's surviving, David said, sealing another sample container. The root systems are being corroded by acid formation in the soil. Traditional crops don't stand a chance. He paused in his work to watch Zara maneuver through the testing area with fluid grace, her suit's mobility systems adapting to the terrain more efficiently than most beings managed with natural locomotion. How's the suit performing? Better than expected, Zara replied, directing the suit's collection arm to gather atmospheric samples at different altitudes. Though I'm getting readings that suggest the contamination isn't evenly distributed. There are pockets of less affected air at higher elevations. Their work was being observed by a growing crowd of colonists whose expressions ranged from desperate hope to polite skepticism. The Tau Ceti colony had been struggling with the contamination for weeks, and several previous consulting teams had declared the situation unsolvable without massive terraforming efforts the colony couldn't afford. David Chen, called colonist Mirdes, whose family operated one of the larger agricultural cooperatives, is it true that you've developed crops that can survive in any atmospheric conditions? Not any conditions, David replied honestly while transferring soil samples to their mobile analysis unit. But we've had success creating hybrid varieties that thrive in environments that would kill traditional crops. The key is understanding exactly what's challenging the plants and engineering specific adaptations rather than hoping for general hardiness. Zara's preliminary analysis revealed the scope of their challenge. The contamination had created soil conditions that were simultaneously too acidic for most earth crops, too toxic for viridian varieties, and too mineral-heavy for anything from the outer colonies. Traditional agricultural solutions would take years to implement, and the colonists had weeks before food shortages became critical. "We need something completely new," Zara announced after completing her environmental assessment. A hybrid that combines acid resistance from sulfurian cave plants, toxin processing from viridian mineral extractors, and growth speed from earth emergency rations crops. "That's at least 4 different genetic lineages," David said, reviewing her analysis. "The complexity of creating stable hybrids with that many integrated traits is exactly the kind of impossible challenge we specialize in," Zara finished. "Though we'll need to work faster than we've ever worked before." They established their field laboratory in the colony's community center, transforming the space into a genetics lab capable of rapid crop development. The colonists watched with fascination as David and Zara worked with seamless coordination, her suit allowing her to access equipment at any height or angle while his intuitive understanding of plant biology guided their genetic selections. "The acid resistance genes are integrating well with the earth crop base," Zara reported, monitoring genetic sequences on multiple displays simultaneously. "But the toxin processing traits are causing growth rate complications. What if we approach it like crop rotation?" David suggested, studying the cellular development patterns. "Instead of trying to make one plant handle everything simultaneously, we create varieties that specialize in different aspects of soil remediation." "Symbiotic agriculture," Zara said, her excitement evident even through the suit's audio filters. "Plants that work together to transform hostile environments into productive ones. That's actually brilliant." Their solution involved creating 3 complementary crop varieties. Pioneer plants that process the worst toxins while preparing soil for secondary crops, stabilizer plants that balanced acidity levels and mineral content, and production crops that provided actual food while maintaining the improved soil conditions. Each variety was designed to thrive in the conditions created by the others, forming an agricultural ecosystem rather than competing individual species. The first test plantings exceeded every projection. Within days, their pioneer crops were visibly transforming contaminated soil patches, while preliminary taste tests of their production varieties received enthusiastic approval from colonist volunteers who'd been subsisting on emergency food supplies. "It's working," Director Colvan announced during their daily progress meeting, her relief evident after weeks of crisis management. "Our atmospheric readings show measurable improvement in the areas where your crops are established. At this rate, we'll have sustainable food production within the month. More importantly," added colonist Mirdes, "the soil improvement is happening faster than your projections suggested. These plants aren't just surviving our contaminated environment, they're actively healing it." The success attracted attention beyond the colony. Representatives from agricultural cooperatives across 3 star systems arrived to observe their techniques, while the Galactic Agricultural Council requested detailed reports on their symbiotic crop development methods. "Dr. Vel'thara," said Councillor Genthara during a formal evaluation session, "your partnership with Dr. Chen has achieved results that contradict several established principles of interspecies agricultural development. How do you account for your unprecedented success rates?" "We account for them by ignoring established principles that don't actually work," Zara replied from within her environmental suit, which had become her permanent work attire during their extended stay on Tau Ceti Prime. "Most agricultural protocols assume that plants should adapt to environments, rather than recognizing that the most successful approaches involve plants and environments adapting to each other." "And the collaborative aspects of your methodology?" Genthara continued. "Your individual expertise areas seem quite different." "That's exactly why our collaboration works," David interjected, transplanting seedlings that were already showing signs of successful environmental adaptation. "Zara understands genetic systems in ways I never could, while I understand practical farming applications she's never had to consider. Our different perspectives create solutions neither of us would reach independently." The real test came when they received an emergency communication from the Kepler Agricultural Collective reporting similar contamination problems across multiple worlds. The scope of the crisis had expanded from a single colony emergency to a system-wide agricultural disaster requiring immediate large-scale intervention. "We can handle it," Zara said during their crisis planning session, "but it means establishing a permanent rapid response team for agricultural emergencies. Our success here proves the methodology works, but scaling it up requires institutional support." The Viridian Science Council is prepared to fund a permanent interspecies agricultural emergency response institute, Director Colvin announced, presenting them with formal documentation. "With you as co-directors, unlimited research budgets, and priority access to any necessary resources." David and Zara exchanged looks across their field laboratory, surrounded by thriving crops that shouldn't exist and colonists who were no longer facing starvation because two supposedly incompatible beings had decided to work together. "There's one condition," Zara said. "The Institute's mission includes developing opportunities for individuals whose capabilities don't match traditional expectations. Agricultural innovation requires diverse perspectives, and we've learned that the most overlooked individuals often have the most valuable insights." "Agreed," Vel'thara said immediately. "Your success here demonstrates that unconventional partnerships produce exceptional results. The Institute will actively recruit individuals whose talents have been undervalued by conventional assessment methods." As they prepared to leave Tau Ceti Prime for their next assignment, the colonists gathered for an informal celebration that felt more like a family gathering than a formal farewell. Children ran between the growing fields, playing among plants that represented the difference between survival and starvation, while adults shared food that had been impossible to grow just weeks earlier. "You know," David said to Zara as they watched the celebration, "when I asked you to be my mate 6 months ago, I thought I was just choosing someone interesting to spend time with. And now?" Zara asked, her suit's external speakers carrying the warmth in her voice. "Now I realize I was choosing a partner for saving worlds," David replied. "Though I have to admit, the world-saving part has been even more fun than I expected." "Just wait until we establish the Institute," Zara said, reviewing the preliminary facility plans on her suit's display. "If we can create an organization that turns overlooked individuals into agricultural innovators, we'll revolutionize more than just crop development." Their transport arrived to carry them toward their next emergency, their next impossible challenge, their next opportunity to prove that the galaxy's most valuable partnerships often began with someone choosing to see worth where others saw only limitations. Behind them, Tau Ceti Prime continued its transformation from contaminated wasteland to thriving agricultural world, testament to the power of two supposedly incompatible beings who had discovered they were perfect complements to each other's dreams.